today we will be talking about both the grant program in general and the application process for the grant program, the CLG Grant Program. I am Catherine Barrier, the Certified Local Government Coordinator for those of you who have not met me. First, we'll talk a little bit about the Certified Local Grant Program in general. The Certified Local Grant Program is a joint program between the Arkansas Historic Preservation Office, that's my office, part of the Division of Arkansas Heritage, and the National Park Service. Every year, the National Park Service gives our agency an operating grant, and we have to pass along at least 10% of that grant to the certified local governments. Usually that works out to about $100,000. How much is determined by a number of factors related to our federal budget. For instance, how much the grant is. The grant has been increasing in recent years, so the amount that is 10% has been increasing. Also, the amount has been increasing recently, but our expenses in our office have not been going up. So we have more available to give out in grants through the CLG program. Our match changes, how we can do that changes. So we actually are going to be giving out about twice that this year through the CLG program. It just, we never know from year to year what the landscape is going to look like. So the Certified Local Grant Program, Local Government Grant Program, because it's a joint program between us and the National Park Service, has sort of hybrid program rules. We have the state program rules, which are in the Certified Local Government Procedures and are also contained in the application. And then those refer to the federal program rules, which are contained in the Historic Preservation Fund Grants Manual. I've got a link to that here. And to the Office of Management and Budget Uniform Guidance, which is 2 CFR Part 200, which you hear a lot about. And I've got a link to those there as well. Hopefully you won't have to run up against those too closely, because we try to help you design your projects and your budgets so that they're detailed enough that we can help you manage not to run into any problems in advance. But it's good to familiarize yourself with some of the basic points of those, or work closely with your city fiscal officers so that you don't run into problems. So who's eligible? All Arkansas certified local governments are eligible, with certain exceptions. You cannot be out of compliance with your existing grants and be eligible to apply. To be out of compliance, that means, for instance, if you have overdue reporting on an existing grant, generally, if you're 2 weeks overdue on a report, you can't invoice us. But at a month overdue, we reserve the right to cancel an existing grant. And at that point, you can't apply for a new grant until you get that resolved. If you have unspent funds balances from a previous grant, if for some reason you have managed to get money that you have not yet spent, in our old grants we had we did funds, we would advance funds. Some people got those and didn't manage to spend it before the end of their grants period and still haven't remediated that. Those people would be out of compliance and wouldn't be able to apply until they got that taken care of. Or if you're out of compliance with your certified local government agreement, that is to say, you're not doing the things that you agreed to do in your original certification agreement. For example, perhaps your certified, your Historic District Commission is not meeting. That happens occasionally. You're not taking part in your National Register reviews, even after you've been given assistance in doing that sort of thing. You're not taking part in your local inventory process, even though you've been given assistance. Just generally not being active as a CLG in the way that you've agreed to, then you wouldn't be eligible for applying for a CLG grant because you're not acting as a CLG. So what projects are eligible? Well, generally, there's certain broad types of projects, such as education and training, National Register and Survey projects, design guidelines, preservation plans. El Dorado just did a preservation plan. It's a great one to look at. And pretty much any other preservation purpose related to your local program and our state preservation goals. It has to be clearly completable within the grant period. If it cannot be completed in the grant period, then we just simply can't fund it. With bricks and mortar projects, you can do bricks and mortar projects. However, it gets complicated. It can only be done on National Register listed buildings or contributing buildings in historic districts. There's an 80-day environmental review after the plans are approved, and there's an easement required if you spend over $10,000 of our funding, and a preservation agreement required under $10,000, and that's from the property owner. You can, assuming your city attorney feels that it's appropriate, funds can pass from the city to a private property owner, but that property owner has to then donate the easement. That varies between cities. What projects are not eligible? Signage is not eligible. The only signage that can be paid for with CLG grants is project signage, which is to say, if you're doing a bricks and mortar project, you're required to put in a sign acknowledging Park Service funding for that project. Otherwise, the kind of signage that's here showing entering historic Oak Lawn Park community, or sign toppers or interpretive signage, that sort of thing, they're not funding anymore. Trainings that are unrelated to historic preservation or that give information that's not consonant with the Secretary of the Interior standards is not going to be fundable. Project work on properties not listed in the National Register. Landscaping and streetscapes, even if they're for improvements in National Register districts, if you're not actually restoring elements that are contributing to the National Register district. For instance, if you're restoring landscape features in a park that are part of the designed landscape that makes that park important, then yes. If you're putting in trees on in a historic district because it makes the downtown look nicer, then no, we can't pay for that. Obviously, we can't pay for work that's not in compliance with the Secretary of the Interior standards, and we cannot pay for any work that has already been started or completed. Any work that's been done before the grant is signed, we can't pay for. So how does the application process work? Generally, we issue a notice of funds availability on October 1st, which tells you how much money we have to spend, what our general criteria are, and how you will apply. We have letters of intent, which are optional but strongly encouraged, due on October 31st. Applications are due on December 31st, and decisions will be made by March 1st. We have 60 days to make the decisions. So what's the letter of intent? The letter of intent is a request from you for a formal response from us on a project concept. It's a time to get help and suggestions from the staff on an idea that you have. It's optional, but if you have a complex project or a project where you're not quite sure how to put together the budget, it's especially important. And it's really a must if you're doing a bricks and mortar project, because most people, if they haven't done a project like this before, they don't know what's involved. They don't know what they need to turn in. We really need to talk to them in advance to make sure that they've designed something properly to meet the Secretary of the Interior standards, because we need to know that when we go to the committee, because the committee needs to be able to tell that something has met the Secretary's standards before they can decide whether or not to fund it. And things like budget are really critical at that point. But a budget is not required for the letter of intent process. It's just that we will then advise you about the best way to put together a budget. So what's required for the application? Generally in the application, what we look for is a project description, a project schedule, a project budget, financial and audit information. We'll talk about that in a minute. And any project-specific supporting documentation that's needed. For instance, photographs, plans, letters of support, easement consent letters, etc. Okay, so some reminders or cautions. There are preview and question list buttons in your applications and at the beginning of the application process. Use those buttons. Don't just try to start filling out the applications from the front and go all the way through. Take the preview button, go through the entire application at once without trying to fill it out. Hit the question list button and print the thing out and go through it and make notes and get everything together that you need before you start filling out the application. Because otherwise you will have a lot of problems. You will end up submitting the application without something you need, or you will submit the wrong thing. If you do it in advance and you go through it slowly, you can always call and ask a question if you don't know what it is that you need. Because if you do not include enough information or detail, the grant committee cannot evaluate whether your project will meet program guidelines or judge it adequately against competing projects. They can't just guess. If they don't have enough information, they just can't take a look at the project. So for a project description, what should that look like? So typically what you want to do is you want to start with a 1 to 2 sentence description of the project. Then put in a detailed description of what you will do, why it will be important to your preservation program, what audience it will serve, who, if any, your project partners will be, and other facts specifically related to that subject. These are noted in the application. They're little examples of what you need for different kinds of projects. For instance, if you have a survey project, you'll need to say if there's been a previous survey in the area, if so, how long ago that survey was done, why it might need to be updated, whether or not you've consulted with the National Register staff about the resurvey, how much change over time has taken place, maybe some photographs of the current state of the area, that sort of thing. You also need to put in a project schedule. The project schedule needs to be detailed enough to demonstrate the project can be completed during the grant period. Generally, projects with deliverables should shoot to be complete in June of 2022 for this grant period. Final invoices are due August 1st, 2022, and National Register nominations will be due in November 2021. This is because they have to go to our State Review Board meeting in April of 2022, and certified local government nominations have to have notice sent out in January of 2022 in order to meet the federally required deadlines. So we have to have a draft in November to make sure that we have something to go out in January. So you should have time if you start immediately, but we need you to be aware of this when you're putting your project schedules together. One thing to take in mind when you're putting your project schedule together is our grant period is longer than the calendar year. So it starts in 1 March. It starts in 1 March and it ends in the following year's, in the summer of the following year. Technically it ends in September, but usually the invoicing is in August. So it goes from March 2021 to September 2022. This is related to the federal fiscal year. The federal fiscal year runs from October to September. And this can get very confusing because a lot of the cities run on the regular calendar year from January to December. The state fiscal year runs from July to June. So you have to be careful, particularly when it comes to administering these grants, to try to keep all of those different years separate. And then again, for any bricks and mortar schedule, you must remember to include an extra 180 days after plan approval for required environmental review, and also remember to include the review for plan approval in the schedule, because it's not like you just have plans and you come in and you start out to bid on them. We have to review them and make sure they're detailed enough before they go out to bid.
Catherine?
Yes?
You, on that last slide, you said 180 days, but the slide shows 80 days.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. It is 80 days. It is 80 days. I misspoke.
Thank you.
Okay, so the project budget. The project budget that you give us in the application should be based on quotes whenever possible. I don't mean that you have to solicit formal quotes, but if you can write up a brief description of what the project is going to be. And for this, I mean things like surveys or nominations, preservation plans, that kind of thing. Contracting for websites, any sort of service contract. Write up a brief description of what your specifications are, and then just email it out to some qualified vendors, hopefully in-state as well as out-of-state, for things like National Register nominations and surveys. And just ask them for a ballpark, because this is just for establishing your budget. Multiple quotes are good. Part of the reason we ask for multiple quotes is because, for instance, we have situations, this happened this year, where somebody got a quote on a context statement, and they got a quote from one person, and the quote was from a person who was local and a solo practitioner, and it was a low quote. And then they went out and they went to bid, or they went to an RFQ process, and they got qualifications packages from people from all over the country. And the people that they're going to end up going with are probably going to end up costing them a lot more than they originally were quoted for. And the person who originally quoted for it didn't submit quals, because people have vastly different rates depending on what kind of operation they are. So we really encourage people not only to get multiple quotes, but to put in their budget a realistic number based not on the lowest number they get, but on a reasonable number for a range of qualified people, so that when they get their quals in, they'll have enough money to pick the person they think is best. And with the budget, we need not just the numbers, but enough detail as to how the numbers were derived, so that the budget, as the committee is confident what's budgeted is enough, but that we won't have a lot of budget left over. That's because we have to give this certain amount out under our grant agreement. And if we have a lot of people who have way over budgeted, just to be careful, we get to the end of the year and we haven't spent enough. And then that's a problem for us with our federal grant. So we try to be very careful in trying to get the budgets as accurate as possible. These need to be line item budgets. And we need one budget for each proposed project. If you're going to propose multiple projects in the same grant application, we need a line item budget for each proposed project. Grant match. If you're going to propose a grant match, you have to let us know what is offered in detail in both amount and source. So who is giving the grant match? What's the amount? What's the amount each person is giving, and what is that coming from? Is it coming from, are you calculating it based on the hours of someone managing the project? If the person managing the project is, if they're counting on their hours, what is their hourly rate and how many hours do you think they're going to be working on it? Grant match must be directly related to the grant project. So for instance, if you've got that person that you're counting their time as the match, that time must be related to managing or participating in that grant project. It can't just be that you're counting their time working on historic preservation as a match to the grant project, which some people get confused about that sometimes. And the grant match must eventually be documented in exactly the same way as regular grant expenditures when they're reported on the quarterly and final reports. All right, so the supporting documentation that needs to come along with the application depends on the type of project. So for bricks and mortar projects, you would need photographs, drawings, etc. Letters of support are required if the project partners that you're proposing are necessary to the project. We have to have letters from them saying that they agree to be a participant. If you have a project that's going to require an easement, we have to have letters of agreement with the application from the property owners, and if there are any, the mortgage holders agreeing to the easement if the project's over $10,000. Okay, so how do we actually do this application thing? Well, it's an online process. You go to this website that I have this web address right here, and what comes up looks like this. You see a lot of icons at the top of the screen. That's because almost all of our agencies who give grants use this website. There are kind of two situations here. One is if your organization has never applied for a grant before, you need to create a new account. If your city has never applied for a grant before in the online platform, you need to create a new account. If your city has applied for a grant before in the online system, you need to contact me and I will add, but you need an account and I will add you as a user on that account. You do not need to create your own new account. Just email me. But you come to this home page and you log in. Oh, I said that already. And then you'll get to something called your applicant dashboard. And it has information about all of your previous applications. But if you're just interested in applying, up here on the left-hand side, there's a little icon and the word apply. And you click on that to apply. And you'll come to this page and it'll ask you to enter an access code. And it's a little confusing because after it says enter an access code, there's a box right underneath. The quick search box, that's not the box that you want. The box that you want is actually over here on the upper right. This page will have a lot of access codes on it. Our access code will not be on this page. Our access code will be given to you in the letter, the Notice of Funds Availability letter. The access code for this year will be CLG 21. You'll put that in there and you'll enter the code. Once you've done that, you will scroll all the way down to the bottom of the page. Most people, you enter that and it looks like nothing happens because there's so much text on the page underneath where that box is. But you have to enter it and then scroll all the way down to the bottom of the page. And once you scroll down to the bottom of the page, it'll show up, there will be two different boxes. One will be for the letter of intent process, and one will be for the actual application process. If you look over here where the orange arrows are, that will tell you where the, that'll tell you what the deadlines are and when those will open to applications. The opening and closing period for each one. So for instance, letter of intent would be open. You could start working in it at the beginning of October and it would end, well, this is last year's. So it ends on November 1st. The regular application would then begin November 1st and it would end, well, this was extended at the end of January. They will have the names of them to distinguish the letter of intent from the regular application. Each of them will have its own separate apply button. That's where the green arrow is. And once you press that apply button, it will take you into the application. Each of these will have some important information describing the grant, describing what activities it will cover, how much money will be available, other information. Please read all of this information and if you can, print it out so that you have it for reference. I was talking about the preview button before. Even if this isn't open yet, even if you can't hit the application button yet, you can still take a look at the application by hitting this preview button over here that's got the orange arrow. That will bring up a review copy of the application. So you can take a look at it even before you can start editing it, which I highly recommend. And again, as I said, before you start, review the application. There is you can just go all the way through it by yourself, or if you work better on paper, like I do sometimes for big, long, multi-question things, there's a button over here on the left where I've got the big red arrow called Question List. If you click that, it will bring up a PDF form with all of the questions in text so that you can print that out and carry it around with you, take it home, read it before you go to bed at night, whatever you do that works for you. That's pretty handy, but I would encourage you to do that. We have to do something under the federal regulations called a risk assessment on each of our grantees and the grant projects. And this is based on a number of things. It's based on performance on previous grants, previous experience managing CLG grants, the fiscal management track record and policies in general of the municipality. It generally affects grant conditions, not awards. And there is a whole section of our application process that asks for information and documentation related to this risk assessment. This was new last year, and I know it kind of tripped a lot of people up. But this is part of the reason that I'm really stressing that you might want to take a look at this early and print out the question list, because you probably want to work with your chief financial officer to make sure you get all of this paperwork together and the answers to your questions rounded up early, so that you have this done before the application gets done. If you have questions about these documents, I would start with your chief fiscal officer before you come to me to ask about them. Not because I don't want to answer your questions, just because some of these things are things that they will know how to find, not me, because they're your fiscal records. So some of the necessary forms that you're going to need to complete and sign are things like a debarment certification. A debarment certification just certifies that the federal government has not barred you from doing business with federal funds because you've done something egregious like default on something or taking federal funds and doing nefarious things with them. A single audit certification certifies that you have had a federal audit done if you have spent over $750,000 in federal funds in a year. So the certification either says you have had the audit done or that you didn't have to have the audit done. If you did not have to have a single audit done, we're going to need a copy of your most recent municipal audit. Everybody has to be audited, so you will have one. It's just a matter of getting your CFO to get it to you. And we need a copy of your municipal conflict of interest policy related to procurement. This is a requirement under the federal regulations that you have one. I've put a citation to what that is in here in case you want to look it up. Okay, so deadlines. Let's recap that. The letter of intent is due on October 31st, 2020. The application is due on December 31st, 2020. We will not be able to allow any substantive changes in the application after submittal because our timeline is short. We are required to turn this around in 60 days, and things go to the review process fairly quickly. One thing to note is that is the state clearinghouse process. After you submit your application to us, you need to submit notice of it to the state intergovernmental clearinghouse. The state intergovernmental clearinghouse works to allow comment from other state agencies and the legislature on projects involving federal funds. And essentially what you do is you fill out a federal SF-424 form, which we are happy to help you with if you run into problems filling it out. There is a link to a 424 form on our application. And then you print out a full copy of your application to us. There is a way to do that on our application form online. And you email the 424 form and the copy of the application and email it to this clearinghouse email address. And that should take care of that requirement. If you have problems with us, you can let us know. We can talk to them. But this is the process that they require because there are federal funds involved. Okay, so how does our evaluation process work? Well, first, we have a policy for the risk assessment, and it's a formula. So we fill that out based on what you submitted. Then a summary memo and information about the risk assessments are forwarded with the applications to the committee. Sometimes we add in a little extra information if we happen to know something about the project that didn't quite get included in application. The committee that reviews these is composed of program area staff in our office. Like for instance, we have somebody from the National Register staff, the education area staff, our technical assistance staff, and our Main Street staff, as well as the director, and usually somebody at the department level will come on. The committee meets in late January or early February. And what we look at is the project or the cost eligible under our rules and the federal rules? Is the budget reasonable and well supported? Are the project and the schedule feasible? How relevant and beneficial is the project to preservation and the mission of the AHPP and the CLG? Does the CLG have the capacity to manage projects of this complexity and funding? And are matching funds proposed? Now, matching funds are not required, but we do take whether or not matching funds are proposed into account. It can, for instance, make a difference between one project and another that matching funds are proposed, but also in some cases it can help us understand that there is a community commitment to a project, which in some types of projects is particularly important. For instance, if you're going to do a preservation plan, it's nice to know that, for instance, the city wants to put up money to do the preservation plan because it shows a special level of commitment, that the plan is not going to just sit on a shelf somewhere. They're actually interested in committing to doing something. So for funding decisions, money doesn't grow on trees. Decisions are made based not just on project eligibility, but also on available funding. We may have two projects that are both great, but we only have $40,000 left after funding all the other great projects, and we have one project that's $35,000 and another project that's $90,000. So the $35,000 project gets funded. Some projects may not be initially funded, but may be eligible. And if that happens, they could be funded later if funds become available. We get turned back funds over the course of the year if people can't spend their money. So if there's still time, maybe we fund one of those projects. Detailed information on eligibility is available in the Historic Preservation Fund Grants Manual. But the best way to figure out eligibility is to submit an LOI if you're not sure, and put in detailed budget projections so that we can kind of flag you if you're thinking about spending money on something that we know we can't fund. Okay, so depending on the project, once we get through the approval phase, there may be some conditions that we have to put on your project. Sometimes the committee would like a proposal reworked and resubmitted to increase the budget, et cetera. For instance, we might get a project in, this happened 2 years ago, where somebody proposed to do a project with a website and a scanning component and an educational brochure component. And the committee felt like it was a good project, but they hadn't adequately planned for the complexity of what would actually need to be done with the website, particularly with regards to access for the visually impaired on the website, and how it was going to interact with some of the other research work that they were doing there, and they wanted them to get more input from some experts in the field. So they wanted to offer them more money to improve the project since we had a little additional funding. So that they got sent back to them with a request to give us reproposal. Sometimes conditions are risk assessment related. So for instance, we'll put things on a tight payment schedule, or we'll say that we'll only reimburse in one lump sum at the end of the project. So grant administration and project rules. Grant administration and project rules are really actually a very complex subject. And if you really want to understand them, you're probably going to need to go back and look at the federal regulations in the Historic Preservation Fund Grants Manual. I am just going to try to hit some of the high points that are most often come up with what we do, but please do not take this as the entirety of what's involved. For us, our grant agreements start on March 15th, 2021 this year. They will include the grant amount, and if there are multiple activities, the activities and then the grant amount from each activity. The timing of the project, for instance, if there's a schedule, the schedule, reporting requirements, any regulatory audit or purchasing requirements that need to go into our grant agreement. Please read this carefully. I find a lot of people don't read it and then they're surprised by things that they're required to do, and they kind of, you know, get to a lump in the road and something happens and there's a panic. So read it carefully to begin with. We do have a required grant training for people who have not done this before once we get to that point. So hopefully we can go over that in more detail then. The grant agreement will be emailed to you. You will sign 2 hard copies and return them to us. We will, this is new for this year, we will then hold these until we receive our final paperwork for our National Park Service grant, and we'll return the signed copy to you with a copy of our federal grant award, which will contain additional information. There are specific types of requirements for different types of projects. We talked about this before, and they will be provided to you with the grant agreement. So see, this is Appendix A. This is the one in Historic Resources Survey and Documentation, and it spells it exactly what everybody's responsibilities are and what should be in a Historic Resources Survey project. These requirements, the ones for the contractors, must be included in bid documents and contracts. There are a lot of duplications in between the various specifications, but there are differences based on obviously what kind of projects they are. The general requirements for projects, they all must meet the relevant Secretary of the Interior standards. So there are a lot of people have heard of the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation of historic properties or for the treatment of historic properties. There are Secretary of the Interior standards and guidelines for archaeology and historic preservation in general that break down into various categories like preservation planning, identification, evaluation, registration, etc. So they also professional standards. So depending on what the project is, it needs to meet the relevant standards and also any additional AHPP standards like meeting the requirements of our survey manual. All right, so general fiscal requirements. Copies of all financial records must be kept for at least 3 years. This is for audit purposes. They must be included in your municipal audit. They must be filed so they are available for Freedom of Information Act requests. Don't have a volunteer keep them at home. This is how they get lost. Also, they're not available when this happens. Really, you ought not to be having volunteers handle the fiscal management of the grants at all. Things tend to get into a really big mess when that happens. The grants and all of the grant paperwork are subject to audit by both the state and federal government. So it's good to keep them very neat and tidy. In terms of general fiscal as well, as I said, detailed information on allowable and unallowable costs is contained in the grants manual and 2 CFR 200. But again, we encourage the creation of a detailed project budget to eliminate questions from the get-go. And just to note, we do not allow indirect costs as a part of the project budget. Quarterly reporting. Grant reports will be required every 3 months to report on activities and funds expended. And we do mean activities. We want to know what you've been doing. Funds expended on grant activities, it's funds expended on grant activities, not grant funds received. Reporting will take place online. It requires receipts and canceled checks. The grant match must be supported, just like we talked about before. And all wages that you count must be supported by timesheets and paychecks. So on October 30th, 2022, a final report will be due. It'll summarize the project achievements and any changes to budget and scope. You will need to deliver a hard copy and a digital copy as appropriate of the final project product, if any. Like for instance, if you produced a brochure or a short video, anything of that kind, that would need to be delivered to us in hard copy and digital copy. Those have to be transmitted to the National Park Service. If it's a bricks and mortar project, you must transmit to us photos of the work in progress and as completed. Sometimes we have problems with this, but those also have to be transmitted to the National Park Service. All of these forms, these are examples of the forms. The forms have to be filled out on paper forms, although these are actually fillable PDFs, and then uploaded to our website. Invoices may be submitted for reimbursement. How that happens is and when is subject to conditions in the grant agreements. They also require receipts and canceled checks. Our usual turnaround is about 2 to 3 weeks in terms of getting payments out. All public information publications supported by the grant must be reviewed by AHPP and approved before dissemination. All bids and contracts must be reviewed and approved before publication and execution, and that includes approval of the consultant and consultant contracts, because we need to approve them as qualified under the Secretary standards. And there must be an acknowledgement of support by HCP and the National Park Service on all work product. This here is an example of a sign that's required if a bricks and mortar project is going on. That needs to be set up, and we provide those. For general procurement, you must conform to the federal purchasing regulations and your own purchasing regulations. All purchases above $10,000 must be competitive by federal law. That doesn't necessarily mean formal sealed bids, although there are state laws concerning sealed bids. However, as I said, you must conform to state and local rules. We require seeking multiple sources and service contracts, even under the $10,000 minimum limit, because it still requires some form of competition. And we have found that sole sourcing, consulting contracts is not generally in the best interests of our certified local governments and the quality of the projects that we get in. So that's the way that we like to see that happen. We encourage people to post their RFQs nationally for any consulting projects. There are national websites. I should stop clicking on things. There are national websites like PreserveNet or the National Trust for Historic Preservation has a website where you can post things, and we found that people who do that get very good quality consulting firms applying for things. So just some miscellany to remember. Do not enter into a contract with a consultant or a contractor or anyone before our grant agreement is signed and we approve the contract with the consultant. Those are, you can't do that. That's not valid. The federal consultant there are federal consultant hourly fee caps. Please do not try to enter into a contract with a consultant based on an hourly fee. They're almost all too high. The federal consultant hourly fee cap is somewhere between $85 and $100 an hour. And the consultants I've been seeing lately are running between about $185 to $250 an hour. So that is problematic. What you need to do is enter into a fixed fee contract. If you hire employees for a position paid for by the grant, you need to advertise the position for a number of reasons. But just keep those in mind when you're planning your project. Other things that come up, travel costs should conform to your local travel policy if you have one. If not, the federal travel per diem rates apply. Catering costs are generally not allowable expenses. So if you're planning on asking to do a conference or a training of that kind, we are not going to be able to pay your catering costs when we do that. Please work closely with us before you develop a grant budget for a project that involves any income, such as selling tickets and charging admission. Income for a project you're paying for with grant funds gets kind of tricky, and we need to make sure that that's as segregated as possible. It can be done, we just need to plan for it from the beginning. I've come to the end of my talk. Does anybody have any questions? Is anyone awake? If you have any questions, yes?
I had to take a phone call, so you may have said this. Is a matching grant required?
No, there is no match required.
Okay.
No match is required. We take it into account if we're deciding between grants. If we have two grants that are exactly the same, and we may take it into account. And it certainly helps if you're asking for a large grant to be able to offer some sort of match. But it is not necessary. And any kind of match helps. And we take in-kind match as well as cash match. Also, this is the other thing that I did not say that people get confused about. People think that employee time managing a project is an in-kind match. That is not an in-kind match. Employee work managing a project is a cash match because the city is actually paying that employee to do the work. If there was a volunteer working on the project, that would be an in-kind match. Does this make sense? Because they would be volunteering their time. If somebody donated lumber to the project, that would be an in-kind match. But if the city is actually paying the person to do the work, then that is a cash match.
Okay.
Catherine, I don't have any questions at this time.
Okay.
Thanks.
Well, if anybody comes up with any, you know how to get a hold of me. And thank you all for being on the call.
Thanks, Catherine.
Have a good day.